thank you for doing this. Do you want to give us a little bit of a background as to what you're working on?
So I'm DJ Nicholson, and I have a program called Inclusiveology that supports school communities in creating meaningful, inclusive opportunities for every child to make sure that every child is included in learning. And I have a program that supports teachers and parents. I have a Facebook group called the Academic Inclusion Network.
What is something that you wish you had learned in school that you maybe didn't get the opportunity to, or you feel like maybe schools are kind of overlooking?
Taking it back to college, that was a long time ago. That was back in the 80s. So it was a little bit different back then, but I know, there was never any discussion about diverse populations. How do we provide equity for students? I had no or very little training on disability awareness. And just from, the perspective of my gen ed friends in the college environment, they weren't getting any kind of support for that at all. It was I feel like my education was very siloed. We spent a lot of time on lesson planning and creating lesson plans and figuring out, as the teacher, I'm going to say this, students are going to respond in this way. And so we would practice and get that kind of drilled into our heads, but there was never guidance on, okay, that's great if all of your students are going to perform the same way at the same time and show their knowledge in the same way. But what do you do when you have students that learn differently or need to respond differently or have a disability or something where they're not falling inside the box like everyone else?
Was there a moment where you started realizing that was a need?
I think it was really several years into teaching, that I realized, I was well prepared for content.
Yeah.
I was well prepared for planning a lesson, but it was the little idiosyncrasies that happen throughout the day and throughout the planning process and throughout the interacting with students that I just didn't get. And I think, it was a wonderful, I in undergrad and grad school, I had great professors, great education, and I don't fault them at all. It's just the reality of once you get out there into, a classroom setting, it's a different animal once you get out there. And it's and part of it is just having that practical application of, just getting out there, and you've got to start teaching and realize like, wow, these are just things that you learn once you're in the mix of all of it.
Once you have the experience. Do you
Right.
think that sometimes as educators, we try to categorize kids and categorize, I guess, people, and like we might other them, so we kind of think, well, those are other kids, so we don't need to worry about them, as opposed to they're all our kids. And we need to have kind of an approach. Everyone should have an approach regardless of which population you have in front of you at that moment.
Yeah, and that goes back to the siloing. So I'm recently retired. I retired early from a public district, and as a coach and a trainer in this district, what I saw was, we're still considering students with disabilities as those kids, or those are your kids. Yeah. I'm a gen ed teacher. You're a special ed teacher. You teach them. Where it's really not the case. I mean, if you look at, and not to go down the rabbit hole of federal law, but, federal law really does say that all students are general education students first. It's part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that, the general education setting is to be considered first. And I think some of that mindset comes from just a lack of knowledge. I don't think teachers, my goodness, teachers are like the greatest creatures in the world. And, those of us that went into teaching, most of us go in because it's part of our DNA. It's our character. It's our heart. Yeah. It's all of it. But, we're in a world where education is so very overwhelming right now.
Yes.
And sometimes it's easier, I think, to say, I don't know how to do that. You do, you go ahead and do it.
100%.
Where I think if teachers are given the knowledge and the tools, that they would embrace it. And I say that from my own experience as a coach, working with some gen ed teachers down here, just giving them the permission to be able to try some different things, and them saying, oh my gosh, like I can do that.
I 100% agree that with the way things are, I feel like it's no longer, there's no longer any excuses that really can be made. I feel like we're all aware of what the challenges are. So
Right.
being able to try to at least talk about it and start addressing it, I think is necessary.
At the end of the day, all we want, whether we are teachers, community members, parents, we want children to be successful.
Yeah.
We do. We want them to be successful. We want them learning in school. We want them growing and gaining and, engaging. And
Yeah.
so if we have kids that are not doing that in a traditional manner or in a way that was written into a script or a plan or a module, however it is,
Yeah.
that we need to think outside the box and just to give permission to be able to do that. Because it doesn't make any sense to me to just say, well, he just doesn't get it, but then we don't give him any tools in order to access whatever it is that we're trying to teach.
Do you feel like it's also linked to like money and financial reasons for why certain things are not, provided, or certain professional development is not given, or why, we kind of have to say like, well, that's your kids, those are your kids and not mine? Like, do you think money plays a role?
Wow, there's so much packed into that question.
I know.
Okay, so the first piece of that, when you talk about funding,
Yes.
I originally, when I at first embarked on my new journey of creating this inclusive program and supporting teachers and parents, I really did think that funding was the number one barrier in getting teachers trained, and it actually isn't. I actually
Oh,
I did a lot of research.
okay.
There are definitely monies available. One interesting thing is, so the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act has never been fully funded. So that's an interesting piece of information. It's never been
Yeah.
fully funded. So in layman's terms, so the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, is the federal law, the federal act that provides monies and services to children with disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so according to IDEA, they are to provide 40% of local monies to fund and support special education services.
Okay.
So, for example, at my district's local level, if locally 60% comes from local, the other 40% should be coming from the federal government, from
Okay.
this IDEA. So right now, though, only 15% is coming from the federal government because it's never been fully funded, even though the act in its originality was from 1975.
Wow. So where's the rest?
So there is actually legislation out there right now to get this Disabilities Act fully funded. So there's there's that lack of funding, but I also think that there are monies out there that are not being used in order to appropriately train teachers. And so really, while there is money available, it's a matter of ensuring that the money is used to train teachers. And so the biggest barrier, truly the biggest barrier, is the fact that teachers are not prepared.
Mm-hmm.
Teachers are not given, new tools and strategies in order to support kids that have learning differences. And our world is changing so quickly, and the way that kids access information is changing, the way they're showing how their learning is changing, and the education system is not changing along with it.
Not
And
fast
so
enough.
no, and so I know, like, you support kids that are gifted.
Yes.
And so whether they're gifted, typical children, or kids with disabilities, we have to be able to keep up with the changing world and be a little bit more flexible. So I think when we keep ourselves in these silos,
Mm-hmm.
which we have a tendency to do,
Yeah.
that we attach responsibility to, a gen ed teacher, a gifted teacher, a special ed teacher. And so if we could kind of strip away the first part of that and just make we're just all teachers.
I totally agree, just from my own experience as far as professional development, just even in terms of, being asked about other types of inclusivity as well, right? Whether we're feeling accepted, not only just students, but also staff members, or whether we're
Mhm.
feeling heard or seen. Are we aware? Do we have exposure to different points of view, perspectives? I think we're very good at asking kids that and not always asking each other that. And I think
Right.
professional development is a great place to do that. But I imagine, or at least from what I hear, the reason we have limited professional development then is essentially always tied back to money. So I guess this is just a matter of people being more aware that there's other avenues
Hmm.
to get
Well,
that funding.
and when you talk about professional development in general, and this kind of goes back to the question that you asked before, I think, we in education, we get so wrapped up and involved in the latest, greatest initiative. There's
Yeah.
always an initiative. There's always something new. And it's different everywhere, but I feel like in education, the challenges are the same across the board. They might, wear a different hat, but ultimately they're the same.
Yes.
But I don't know, I just feel like we're turning a corner. I'm hoping where we can just get back to some basics. Like, it's great to have goals and, strategic plans for how we're going to do things, but it still goes back to, how do we get every child included in learning? How do we get every child successful? When kids are successful, teachers feel successful.
100%.
When kids are successful, their parents feel successful. Like, it takes a village.
I think it was actually at work where I was told about a study, and I don't recall which study it was, but they were mentioning how essentially, and I'm sure you know this already, they considered in this study, they considered all types of factors that were the reason behind or were strongly associated with why a student was or was not successful. And they considered socioeconomic status, they considered ethnicity, they considered, single parent homes versus other, family dynamics. And the one thing that it would always come down to as being the most kind of heavily weighted factor was the teacher.
Right,
And that was just overwhelming in the best of ways, because it makes us feel very, aware of how significant our job is. But it
right.
also, for me, furthered we have to kind of be strong and firm in what we know before we can really pay things forward. What do you see for yourself in terms of being able to address some of these issues?
So my ultimate goal is to, get in and work in schools, work with schools as a community, to work with every member of a school staff in order to begin to have, deeper conversations and coaching and training about what it means to be inclusive as a community. I think that that's where it has to start.
Yep.
That, what you talk about, feeling safe and feeling comfortable even as an adult. We all feel like a part of a community. We all feel safe when we can be ourselves, when
Yes.
we're given the things that we need to be successful, when we're given grace, when we're given opportunities to try different things, when it's okay to make a mistake and not be perfect and problem solve, and give them experiences where they're going to feel safe, whether
Mm.
they're in the classroom, whether they're out in the hallway, they're in the cafeteria, but that it's a community feel. I wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago about the difference between doing inclusion and being inclusive. I've talked to some, principals, around the country, and teachers that say, "Oh yeah, we're doing inclusion. We're doing inclusion. Well, yeah, we do that." I said, "Okay, but what does that look like?" "Yeah, we've got some kids there, they've got, some disabilities, and they're in our classrooms." I'm like, "Well, how is that working? Tell me a little bit about what that looks like."
Mm.
So, for me, the takeaway from that is, if I hear someone say, "Oh yeah, we do inclusion," that is, a school that takes a child with a disability and just puts them in a space.
Mm.
And then that's it. It's just like,
Yeah.
there's big companies that have, a DEI facilitator, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, okay, we've got that. We're going to check that off. So the difference between like doing inclusion and really being inclusive.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're being inclusive, children have a sense of belonging. You feel that kindness, you feel that cooperation on your campus. You've got teachers that are collaborating together for the greater good of all of their students. You have students supporting each other. There's a feeling on campuses where they are being inclusive. And I'm fortunate that I've actually seen that and I've felt it. And it's magical when you can look around and you can see that everyone is there for every child, and we're working together to be stronger to support everyone. So ultimately, that's my ultimate goal. My ultimate goal as well, even though it's a smaller goal, is really teachers need information. If they don't know, they just don't know. And so part of wanting to create a group, this academic inclusion network, part of doing that was just to provide teachers a space to just come on over here. We're going to get training. We're going to get resources. You're going to ask questions, and I'm going to give you the information that you need. Even if you don't think that you need it right now, you might need it later.
Teachers are overwhelmed with so much already. I mean, you know better than anyone. So I definitely agree. But I do think after a certain point, once you are made aware, then there's a certain level of responsibility for us to then, to learn and to kind of better ourselves. I think that kind of comes with the territory of being a teacher too. We kind of are naturally curious, and naturally, I would imagine, want to always challenge yourselves to do the next best thing. But again, when you're asking for help or you're going out and looking for knowledge, that community piece has to be built in so you can have support and you can have the resources available to you. Because I don't think it's a lack of most teachers. I can't say 100%, but I don't think it's for a lack of wanting to know or wanting to include or wanting to be a community. I think it's not always knowing where to go or how to go about doing it. So
a teacher that I worked with a couple years ago, she was a gen ed teacher, and she had a student in her classroom with a significant disability. So he was receiving instruction on alternate standards. I coached her and worked with her on, modifying instruction. She was really comfortable with that, but she was frustrated by the amount of time that she felt like she had to be with this student all the time. And I said, so tell me a little bit about why you think you need to spend so much time with him. She says, well, he can't read, this is fourth grade and he's, reading on a, kindergarten or a first grade level. He doesn't know, he's really smart if somebody reads it for him. So I'm always having to read him everything. And I said, oh my goodness. So let's try something. So I gave her a subscription to Learning Ally. I showed her how to use Immersive Reader. I showed her how to use text to speech and speech to text for reading and or writing. And so I just gave her some really basic, assistive technology tools where I could explicitly show him how to use these tools. So when he learned how to use these tools, he became more independent.
Right.
She could back away a little bit. And, her response to me was, I had no idea that anything like this was out there, but there's just not enough. There's just not enough people to go one at a time and show everyone how to use some of these tools and give permission on how to do that. And so it opened, just showing her that just opened up the door for the two of us, just as like a collegial relationship.
Yes.
For her to say, oh my gosh, DJ, I have this situation. Now what can I try? And so it kind of like, ignited something in her of like, oh my gosh, I've got permission. And I think sometimes, just knowing that, okay, at the end of the day, we want kids to be successful. We have to get them there.
Yes.
Try this, try this, try this. From the parent perspective, I feel like they get a lot of information in, an individual education plan meeting. So in the IEP meeting, they're getting a lot of good information about, their students' present levels, what the goals are and what the expectation is. But then, so what's happening then with the delivery of instruction? What happens there? And I think that there's a breakdown.
Do you feel, I have two questions. One is, have you ever received any resistance on this from any, whether teachers, students, parents? I'm gonna assume probably yes, but I'm
Yes.
curious.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And then my second question is, how do we talk to other kids about inclusivity? Because I think that's also an important piece of the puzzle that we kind of like shove under the rug because we think kids can't handle it, or it's pointing out, differences when we shouldn't, things like that.
Yes, I've had resistance to the point of anger and profanity directed at me. Obviously, I don't take it personally because it's not personal. I think it comes from a place of fear. It comes from a place of frustration. And it comes from, this is the way that we've always done it, and stop trying to shake things up. For us, we're stuck. We're, like I said at the beginning, we're stuck in a rut. Just in education, we're stuck, and we need to like, move the needle.
Shake some things up.
we do definitely need to shake things up, and I am certainly not afraid to do that, because we do have to have these, these somewhat difficult conversations. I don't think they're difficult because this is just the world I live in. I love challenges. I love problem solving and figuring things out, for the betterment of all kids. Yeah. When it comes to helping kids understand kids with disabilities, I think kids are wonderfully resilient. I think they are the sweetest, most caring members of our society. I really do. And it's just, when we build cultures where we understand and respect that everybody is different, I think it really stems from there. But that's a societal problem.
Right. And I think the reason that I asked the question is because so often I feel like we're projecting our own adult fears onto the kids and assuming they're going to have those same fears. And I feel like, but adults will sometimes almost set it up as if it's inevitable that it'll create this problem or that problem. And again, maybe it's that fear that you're talking about. But I always find that interesting that we sometimes project our own fear onto our students.
As adults, we have to remember that not all disabilities are visible. And, statistically, 15% of the world's population has a disability of some sort. So not everyone with a disability has a wheelchair or hearing aids or a device or something that's visible. So it's a matter of, like I said, understanding that people are different, having difficult conversations. I had a conversation with a woman in my neighborhood earlier this week. We were both walking, and there was, and she was walking her dog. We were having just a conversation on the sidewalk. Another neighbor walked by. This other neighbor is autistic, and she was walking these, 5 little dogs. And the woman that I was speaking with said, "Oh," she goes, "that's just so weird." She goes, "Oh, that's just so much." And I said, "Well, do you know her?" She goes, "No, it's just really weird." And I said, "She's autistic." She goes, "Well, I figured that." And I said, "Well, I said, everyone that has autism or is autistic, they're not all the same, just like people are not all the same."
Right.
I said, I've spoken with her. I said, but she struggles with, social boundaries and, appropriate social engagement. And that is just who she is, but she's incredibly intelligent. So the woman that I was speaking to, she says, "Wow." She was like, "I guess I just never thought of it like that." She goes, "She just like comes across as being like really weird." And I'm like, "Well, but when you think about it, like we all have our own little bit of like
weird
weirdness, And I mean, I know like I can be a little weird myself, and I have friends that call me the nutty professor. And it's, but I embrace that, and I just embrace my weirdness. But it's about embracing people's differences, and it's not let people live their lives so you can live yours.
Like when I hear that type of a story, again, to me, that when I hear that, I'm like, well, I wonder what's going on with her that made her even feel like she needed to say, or she saw it that way, right? So I wonder if how much of it we also have to do work internally on ourselves, because I do feel like the more content we are inwardly, like the less likely we are to create those judgments, or at least go to the negative before trying to understand or empathize, like building that empathy essentially.
When it comes to building empathy for people with disabilities, I think it really depends too on your age,
Mm,
because I'm in my 50s. So when I was growing up in Massachusetts, the state institutions were starting to close down.
okay.
And so, and I remember this from childhood. And so people that are, my generation, we were children when institutions were closing, and kids were starting to go from the institution into public school.
Okay.
So I remember, the change in these like new federal laws where, they were starting to, remove kids from institutions. And suddenly we have all these people with disabilities now, like they're in schools, and they're in our community, and they're in group homes, and they're living, as we all should, as part of a community where they had been isolated. So I
Mm,
think they're, depending on the age, there's a disconnect
yeah.
between, what I experienced growing up and what is actually happening now.
But I really like what you're trying to do also, because there is a fear that we also don't want to do anything wrong, right? We don't want to offend anyone. We don't want to
Right.
insult anyone. We don't want to make somebody self-conscious. In order to avoid all that, we just don't do anything or say anything, even though we might very strongly desire to do something or
Right.
include. So I'm guessing being able to have this space will address a lot of that.
So to have the space to have the conversations, for me to be available to, hop on a call, do a 15-minute, little mini coaching call to work through something. And then on the other side of that, to have, Inclusiveology as a program in a school
Yeah.
to grow a community. So
Yeah.
everyone is growing empathy and kindness and belonging. That it's not, oh, well, we have a school, and in those classrooms over there, that's what they do.
Yeah.
That's what they do, because we can't do that anymore. We can't do that anymore. That's what we did in the 70s. No. So when it comes to including kids in your room and making them feel like part of a community, it's giving them, flexible ways to show what they know. It's to give them options on where to sit. Something as
Mhm.
simple as, flexible seating,
Mhm.
making sure that you have chairs in your classroom that are comfortable, where if they're going to sit in a chair, their feet are flat on the floor, so they're grounded
Mm.
and they're positioned in a way that's going to keep them focused.
Mm.
That they have, if they're feeling antsy, they can stand up at their desk, or they can go stand in the back of the classroom, that they can sit on the floor if they need to, that you're
Right.
honoring how they're feeling.
That's huge. Just for them to have space to communicate what they need to, and also for them to reflect on what it is they do need, because some of them are so young, they wouldn't necessarily be aware of that yet.
Right, right. And so, because my primary focus is elementary, that I
Mm.
would say to elementary teachers all, quite often, when they're planning for instruction, and then I go in and I see instruction, and I see, every single student sitting in the same blue plastic chair, kids' feet,
Yeah.
their feet are dangling, they're kind of all over the place, they're wiggly, they're in
Yes.
second grade, they're all over the place. What's your learning outcome? Well, I want them to be able to, recall the main idea and, three key details in what they're reading. I'm like, okay,
Mhm.
so this little guy over here, he's not even hearing you because he is all over the place.
Yep.
So you might want to ask him, could you think better or listen better if you were sitting on the floor, if you were grounded? I mean, there's a lot of, and there's a lot of study done about that too, is that you have to be grounded and positioned for learning in order to stay
Mm.
focused, stay engaged, internalize what you're doing. I remember the time I was a participant in a training, and the only chair left, because I was one of the latecomers. I wound up sitting in a chair that was too tall for me, and my feet didn't touch the floor.
Oh
And
no.
it was so unnerving for me. I was so uncomfortable. I thought I would absolutely crawl out of my skin. It
Yeah.
felt like my chair was 6 feet tall, and everybody was like, what is that weird lady doing? Like wiggling all around in her chair. And I had to excuse myself. I had to go and stand over to the side. And I stood up the entire time, but I was like, oh my gosh, I can think. I can focus in on what I'm learning. I can be engaged because I'm grounded and I'm settled. So it's, we have, kiddos that are coming from all kinds of backgrounds and traumas. They haven't eaten since they had school yesterday, or they had no sleep because mommy was partying all night, or whatever it is. And most teachers, I mean, they absolutely know their kids, but you got to know your kids and honor where they are. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they all sit in the same spot. And that's just one little piece of it.
We have to be okay with that. It's going to be hard. I don't think that there's an easy way around, or like a convenient way around the actual fix of these challenges. And and it's a long-term trying and failing, and to do that with, several students, 20, 30 children every day. It's exhausting and it's hard, but I think that we have to be almost mentally prepared for that.
I think one of the things that helps is knowing that it's a very big task, but when we chunk it down into digestible bites with support, oh my goodness, I cannot tell you how many trainings I've sat in or I've had to give where it's just the training with no follow-up. It's 3 hours of sitting with no follow-up, 6 hours of sitting with no follow-up. If we break things down into digestible bites and we give people, here, try this, and then I'll check in with you and see how it's going.
It's that second part, the checking in, that is so key.
It's the checking in. It's the accountability piece. It's is this relevant to my situation? Is this something that I'm really going to use? Does my principal know that this is something that would help my kids?
Yeah, and we want to be excited to try it. It shouldn't feel like just, oh, here's just another PD, or
here we go.
I also think that we, again, as teachers, and I'm including myself in this, have to be willing to relinquish a little control and be willing to say, like, you know what, I don't know, and I'm failing at this. And if I don't get some help, I'm going to fail this kid, and that's not okay. Because I think it's natural human nature where our pride or confidence or ego, whatever you want to call it, might come into play. Because we're teachers, but we want to do well and then do everything that we are doing to the nth degree. So I do think that this is, again, when you feel safe and in a space where you can communication, again, being able to say, like, hey, I'm not happy with how this is going. How are we going to make this better?
But I think when we can get to the point where we can, give students tools that they can use, where students know, like, this is available to me if I need it to be successful. It empowers kids, it makes them independent, and it takes away that teachers need to kind of govern the classroom. I think, we're definitely moving away from, the old classroom model where the teacher stands in the front, the rows are, we're definitely moving, and that's a beautiful thing. So when you go into a classroom and there's that like productive conversation, productive chaos, so to speak, we need to give them the tools, but teachers can't give kids tools unless they have them.
I think this all sounds amazing. I really appreciate you sharing your ideas and your goals, and I'm going to definitely pay this forward, of course.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It was so nice to talk to you. We could talk all day about this.
Absolutely, exactly. And I hope
I'm sure we'll have follow-ups.
Yes, I would definitely hope so. You got to hold us accountable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much again, and I'll speak to you soon.
All right, sounds good. Thanks. Bye.